Imagine being humiliated and kicked out of a place just because of your appearance. That's exactly what happened when James, an apparently ordinary man, walked into a luxury store. But what no one knew was that he had a secret that could change everything. What he did the next day left the store owner speechless. James Carter was a man who exuded strength, not only because of the impeccable suits he always wore, but also through the calmness with which he navigated life's adversities. He was the CEO and founder of Carter Enterprises, one of the largest investment firms in the country. James was not only known for his sharp business acumen, but also for his charisma. When he spoke, people listened. When he acted, he turned dreams into reality. Behind all the brilliance of his success, however, lay a story of struggle that not everyone knew. James had grown up in a small town in the southern United States, where prejudice was still woven into the social fabric. Early on, he learned the art of resilience. His mother, a hard-working nurse, always said, "James, people may judge you by your color, but never let that define who you are." Those words echoed in his mind with every step he took. Now, decades later, he had overcome unimaginable obstacles and reached an enviable position. Yet, despite all his wealth and status, James knew that prejudice was a shadow that still loomed over him and so many others. That morning, while reviewing reports in his luxurious office, an article caught his attention. It was an exposé about racist practices in luxury establishments, with customers being discriminated against or even expelled by prejudiced employees. The article included specific accounts about a store called Elliott's Emporium, famous for its exclusive products and equally notorious for its arrogance toward customers. James set the report aside and stared at his computer screen. He felt a mix of indignation and determination. Why, in the 21st century, were these stories still so common? He knew he could simply brush it off, ignore it as just another piece of news, but something about it deeply unsettled him. "I need to see this for myself," he murmured. Shortly afterward, he stood in front of his mirror at home. He wore a simple shirt, worn-out jeans, and comfortable shoes, a stark contrast to his usual attire. He looked at himself in the mirror and smirked ironically. "Today, I'm just an ordinary man." On his way to the store, James thought about his approach. He knew that the way he dressed and acted would completely influence how he would be treated. For years, he had observed how appearances could be deceiving and how quickly people made superficial judgments. Arriving in the city center, he parked on a busy street and walked toward the entrance of Elliott's Emporium. The windows gleamed under the sunlight, showcasing Italian leather bags and diamond-encrusted watches. The imposing facade seemed almost to repel those who didn't fit its standard. James took a deep breath and stepped inside. As soon as he crossed the threshold, a familiar sensation enveloped him. It was a mix of suspicion and hostility, something he knew all too well from his younger years. He noticed how the employees' eyes assessed him, as if trying to determine whether he belonged there. James wandered through the elegantly decorated aisles, pretending to be interested in some products. He made a point of maintaining a humble demeanor, but he observed every detail around him: the whispers, the wary glances, and the staff who completely ignored him. Even though he was accustomed to luxurious environments, James felt a growing discomfort. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed such behavior, but this time, he was there to do something about it. The facade of Elliott's Emporium glistened under the morning sunlight, with display windows showcasing luxury items, seemingly designed to impress. Swiss watches, Italian handbags, and sparkling jewelry were arranged like works of art. The imposing entrance, with automatic glass doors and an elegant sign, reinforced the exclusivity the store promised. James took a deep breath before stepping inside. Wearing faded jeans, a simple shirt, and worn-out sneakers, he knew he didn't fit the expected profile of the store's clientele. The air was thick with expensive fragrances, and the marble floor gleamed immaculately. He took a few steps forward, allowing the atmosphere to envelop him. The interior of the store was even more opulent. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, illuminating the space with a warm, sophisticated glow. The attendants, impeccably dressed, seemed strategically positioned, ready to assist customers or ignore them, as James would soon realize. As he walked through the store, James noticed how the employee's eyes followed him. A white attendant near the entrance, likely in his 30s, glanced at him quickly, furrowing his brow slightly before redirecting his attention to the tablet in his hands. Other attendants, who had been arranging displays or assisting customers, began to observe him with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. James paused in front of a display case featuring luxurious watches. He leaned slightly forward to examine the details of a golden model. A younger attendant, standing rigidly, approached him without enthusiasm. "May I help you, sir?" the attendant asked, his voice polite but lacking genuine interest. "Just looking, thank you," James replied in a calm tone. The attendant nodded but stayed close, watching James out of the corner of his eye. The unease was palpable, as though his presence required monitoring rather than assistance. James continued walking, moving past the section of handbags and accessories. He observed other customers being greeted with warm smiles and immediate offers of help. A man in a well-tailored suit was accompanied by 2 attendants as he examined a handbag. A woman dressed elegantly was offered perfume samples before even asking. But James, he was met with distance. As he approached another display, he noticed a blonde employee whispering something to her colleague, both casting furtive glances in his direction. James pretended not to notice, but he made sure to remember every detail. When he reached the back of the store, near a shelf of leather bags, James stopped once more. The discomfort around him intensified. Fixed gazes, interrupted conversations. The message was clear. His presence was unwelcome. He knew he was being judged, not for his actions, but for his appearance. And yet, the worst was still to come. As he examined a black handbag on a nearby shelf, James felt a distinct presence approach. Without needing to turn, he could tell it was someone important. The air around him seemed to shift, growing heavier. He steadied himself for what was coming but maintained his composed demeanor. The real test was about to begin. James stood still in front of the leather bags as the presence of Richard Elliott became unmistakable. Without needing to turn, he knew it wasn't just another employee. When he heard the voice, filled with authority masked by false politeness, his suspicion was confirmed. "Sir, I believe you may have entered the wrong store. This doesn't seem like the right place for you," Richard said, with a smile that felt more like a shield for his true intentions. "And your presence here is clearly making other customers uncomfortable." James slowly turned to face him. His eyes were calm but firm, and he responded without hesitation. "It seems like the only person uncomfortable here is you." For a moment, Richard was speechless, his expression freezing in a mix of surprise and irritation. He hadn't expected such a direct response. Straightening his shoulders, he stepped closer, reducing the distance between them. "I don't think there's anything more to discuss," Richard said, his voice now colder and more resolute. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The silence in the store was almost tangible. Employees and customers had stopped what they were doing, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. The tension in the air was undeniable. James knew this was the kind of humiliation many people face daily, but he wasn't about to let Richard walk away without consequence, at least verbally. He took a deep breath and, maintaining his composure, replied, "Interesting. Do you believe expelling someone based on assumptions about who they are is a good way to run a business?" Richard narrowed his eyes, his smile now entirely gone. "I'm not going to debate how I run my store. I'll ask you again. Leave, or I'll call security." James took a step back, not in submission but with deliberate calm. His posture remained steady, his eyes locked on Richard's. He knew there was nothing more to say that would change the man's mind. "Don't worry. I've seen everything I needed to see," James said, with a calmness that carried weight. He turned and began walking toward the exit. His steps were slow but purposeful. Every movement seemed like a statement. He wasn't retreating. He was preparing. As he passed through the glass doors, sunlight warmed his face. He paused for a moment on the sidewalk, looking back at the store's facade, then gave a faint smile, not of joy, but of determination. He knew that scene, that moment, was just the beginning of something much bigger. Inside the store, Richard adjusted his suit with irritation, but the tension in the air lingered. His employees remained silent, and customers glanced discreetly, their expressions a mix of discomfort and silent judgment. Richard ignored it all, convinced he had done the right thing. The next morning, Richard Elliott arrived early at the store. The soft morning light streamed through the windows of Elliott's Emporium, but he barely noticed its glow. His mind was consumed by the growing financial problems that loomed over the business like a shadow. Sales had been declining for months, and the accumulated expenses were beginning to threaten the stability he had worked so hard to maintain. He ascended to his office, where his management team was already waiting for the daily meeting. The room was silent, filled with a palpable tension. The reports scattered across the table painted a grim picture. Continuous drops in sales, reduced customer traffic, and suppliers pressing for overdue payments. "We need a plan," Richard began, his voice firm but tinged with concern. "Our survival depends on it." One of the managers, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, responded. "Mr. Elliott, the investor we mentioned last week, is still our best hope. If we can secure his support, we'll have the capital injection we need to turn things around." Richard nodded, clenching his jaw. He knew that the arrival of this investor was crucial, but the delay in receiving a response was making him restless. "When will we hear back?" Richard asked, looking directly at his financial manager. "Today." The consulting team said he recently visited the store for a final evaluation. Richard narrowed his eyes in surprise. "He's already been here, and no one told me." The manager hesitated before responding. "From what we understand, he wanted to keep the visit discreet, to observe how the store operates on a typical day." Richard nodded slowly, but his irritation was evident. He hated not having full control over situations like this. The meeting continued, but the tension among those present only deepened. Meanwhile, across the city, James Carter was in his own meeting, reflecting on what had brought him to this moment. Decades earlier, James had been an ambitious young man starting his career as an analyst at a small investment firm. Despite his evident talent, he faced countless barriers. He was constantly underestimated. His presence in meetings was often ignored, and colleagues made subtle yet loaded comments. "You're good at what you do, James, but this industry requires a certain level of sophistication that not everyone has," an old boss had once said to him in one of the many conversations that still echoed in his memory. But James never let those moments define him. He worked even harder, learning, growing, and proving his worth through tangible results. Within a few years, he rose through the ranks, earned respect, and eventually founded his own company, Carter Enterprises. Now, as one of the most influential businessmen in the country, James had the power to change the course of entire businesses like Elliott's Emporium. However, he was deliberate in supporting only those that represented the values he held dear: respect, inclusion, and dignity. Back at the store, Richard anxiously awaited an update about the investor. He had no idea that the man he had publicly humiliated the day before was the very one whose decision would now determine the future of his store. The morning began like any other at Elliott's Emporium. Employees were arranging displays and adjusting shelves, while Richard Elliott sat in his office, reviewing discouraging reports. He had no idea this day would be unlike any other. The automatic doors of the store opened, and James Carter entered, now impeccably dressed. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark blue tie. Beside him was Michael Harris, his attorney, holding a leather briefcase. James's presence immediately caught the attention of the staff, who stopped what they were doing to watch the scene unfold. A moment of awkward silence passed before one of the younger attendants murmured to a colleague, "Isn't that the man Mr. Elliott kicked out yesterday?" James walked calmly toward the main counter, where a blonde attendant struggled to maintain her composure. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could utter a word, Richard appeared, drawn by the growing murmur among his staff. When Richard saw James, his expression froze. He immediately recognized the man he had treated with such disdain the day before. But now something was different. James was no longer the unlikely customer Richard had assumed him to be. There was something about his posture, the way he commanded the room, that was impossible to ignore. "Mr. Elliott," James began, his voice calm but firm, "I believe you remember me." Richard tried to mask the panic rising within him. He straightened his suit and forced a nervous smile. Yes, of course. May I ask what brings you back to my store? James stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Richard. I'm here to clarify who I am and why I was here yesterday. I'm James Carter, CEO of Carter Enterprises, and the primary investor your team has been so eagerly waiting for. My visit yesterday was an evaluation. James's words hit like a direct blow, and Richard staggered slightly. Around them, the staff exchanged shocked glances, some even visibly taken aback. Mr. Carter, I had no idea, Richard stammered, his voice faltering. James raised a hand to stop him. His expression remained serious, with an undertone of frustration in his voice. It doesn't matter whether you knew who I was. What matters is how you treat the people who walk into your store. Yesterday, you didn't just judge me. You made it abundantly clear that you believe exclusivity means exclusion. Richard took a step closer, raising his hands in a pleading gesture. Mr. Carter, please allow me to apologize. I made a terrible mistake, and I promise this doesn't reflect the values of my store. Stop, James interrupted, his voice firm. It reflects exactly the values of your store, and that's why I won't be investing a single cent here. Richard was left speechless. He tried to form a response, but nothing came out. The atmosphere in the store was heavy, the employees frozen in place, listening to every word James said. James glanced around the store, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. True exclusivity isn't about whom you exclude, Mr. Elliott. It's about creating something everyone wants to be part of. You failed at that. With those words, James gave a slight nod to Michael, who followed him toward the exit. The sound of their footsteps echoed on the marble floor as Richard stood rooted in place, bearing the weight of what had just transpired. As James passed through the glass doors, he paused briefly, looking back at the store's facade. He didn't need to say anything else. His message had been made clear. Inside the store, Richard felt the uncomfortable gaze of his employees on him. At that moment, he knew that his reputation, and that of Elliott's Emporium, had been irreparably damaged. The days following James Carter's return were devastating for Richard Elliott and his Elliott's Emporium. James's public rejection as an investor quickly sent ripples through the business community. Within hours, rumors began to spread among suppliers and clients about what had transpired. Social media amplified the story, and former customers seized the moment to share their own experiences of discrimination at the store. Meanwhile, the competing store supported by James was thriving. Reports showed a significant surge in sales, and news of the investors' alignment with their values of inclusion and respect attracted even more customers. The reputation of Elliott's Emporium was in tatters. Richard spent his days in tense meetings, desperately trying to save the business. He discussed strategies with consultants and managers, searching for a solution to the crisis, but nothing seemed to work. Promotions failed to draw customers, employees grew increasingly demotivated, and suppliers began cutting ties due to unpaid bills. One afternoon, Richard descended to the store's main floor. He walked through the empty aisles, passing the still bright display windows and the impeccably organized shelves. What once felt like a temple of luxury now felt hollow, not just physically, but in spirit. He stopped in front of a display case, showcasing leather handbags. Looking at the reflection, he didn't just see the products. He saw himself. For the first time, Richard began to question everything. Was the problem truly the market, the customers, or was it him? Across town, James Carter stood in a conference room. Before him was a group of young entrepreneurs eager to hear him speak. He rose and began his presentation, sharing stories from his journey. Respect isn't just a moral value, it's the foundation of any successful business, he said, his voice firm yet calm. How you treat people says more about your brand than any marketing campaign ever could. He paused, looking at the attentive faces in the room. What happened recently with one of the city's most well-known stores wasn't an accident. It was the result of years of decisions rooted in exclusion rather than inclusion. My mission is to support businesses that understand true exclusivity means creating something special for everyone, not just a select few. The applause was immediate, and James felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He knew his message was being heard. As the day came to an end, James returned to his office, gazing at the sunset through his window. He reflected on his journey, the challenges he had faced, and the impact he now had the power to create. Back at Elliot's Emporium, Richard looked around the empty store. He knew he had failed, not just as a businessman but as a leader. The final sale signs began to appear in the windows the next day, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of a hard lesson he would carry into the future. Elliot's Emporium was now a shadow of its former self. The once glittering display windows, symbols of exclusivity, were now covered with final sale signs. The store's activity was limited to customers hunting for discounts, while the remaining employees worked with expressions of resignation. Richard Elliot spent his days in his office, surrounded by reports that only confirmed the inevitable. The store was finished. He had tried everything: aggressive promotions, cost-cutting measures, even reaching out to other potential investors, but it was too late. James Carter's decision and the subsequent public fallout had undone years of work in just a few weeks. One afternoon, Richard descended to the store's main floor. The shelves were being emptied, and the few remaining customers rifled through the leftover products with little enthusiasm. Margaret, the store's longest-serving employee, saw him approaching. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Elliot, I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to work here. Despite everything, I've always valued the years I spent at Elliot's Emporium." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He knew Margaret, like many others, had given her loyalty to the store for years, only to see it crumble. "Thank you, Margaret," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. As she walked away, he looked around, taking in what was left of his empire. Every empty shelf felt like a silent accusation, every demotivated employee a reflection of his decisions. Across town, James Carter was at his new partner's store, attending an event celebrating its expansion. The venue was buzzing with cheerful customers, enthusiastic staff, and business partners who shared the same vision of inclusion and respect. During the event, James was invited to say a few words. He stepped onto a makeshift stage in the center of the store, holding a microphone with a light smile. "This moment is not just about business. It's about principles," he began, his voice commanding attention. He glanced around the room, ensuring his message resonated with everyone. "We've shown that success doesn't need to be built on exclusion or prejudice. Respect, empathy, and dignity are the true foundations of a lasting enterprise." The store erupted in applause as James stepped off the stage, shaking hands with customers and employees alike, exuding an aura of confidence and optimism. Meanwhile, Richard stood alone in Elliot's Emporium, walking slowly toward the entrance. He looked at the facade one last time, remembering the pride he once felt when the store first opened. Now, it was nothing more than an empty space, marked by the weight of his choices. Across the street, he noticed an illuminated billboard bearing the slogan of James's new store: "Inclusion is the new luxury." Richard sighed, feeling the full burden of his failures. He knew this wasn't just the end of Elliot's Emporium, but the beginning of a hard and necessary lesson. As James left the grand opening event, he gazed at the city's horizon, his expression firm and confident. He knew his work was only beginning, but the impact of his actions was already visible.
Hi, this is James. Throughout my life, I've faced prejudice. Situations of racism have tested me, shaped me, and sometimes hurt me deeply. But this time, I had the chance to do something concrete about it, to show that dignity and courage can transform realities. However, how often do racism and prejudice go unnoticed? How many stories like mine remain untold? This is just one part of my journey. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this. Together, we can shed light on these realities and inspire change. Thank you for watching. See you next time.